Well, I'm joined by David Maddox, political editor of The Express Online, and indeed by Henry Hill, deputy editor of Conservative Home. Henry, you are very, very close to the pulse, the thought process of those to whom the Conservative Party really matters. They are headed for disaster, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you look at the polls, you have to go back, I think, to 2021 to find a poll where they were ahead. You have to go back to autumn 22 to find a poll where they were only a single digits behind, and they now have less than a year to go until the election. The number 10 hopes there will be some narrowing over the course of the year, and you can sort of see why. Over the summer there'll be less pressure on fuel bills, there'll be less pressure on the NHS.
Depends on the Red Sea.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, this is it. Yeah. So they hope things will recover a bit, but from here, there's nothing in recent British history to suggest you can win. The only poll rating I can think of that's collapsed that much was Theresa May's in 2017, where she at one point was leading Labour 50 points to 25. But that's a kind of mistake only the government can make. And Sir Keir Starmer has shown no sign that he's going to do anything remotely as brave as trying to sort of fix social care. So no, they are cruising for an election disaster.
David Maddox, your readers, the most Brexit newspaper.
Yeah.
Very.
They want you to come back.
That's interesting. They do, but I mean, having said that, your readers overwhelmingly voted for Boris Johnson in 2019. How great is the sense of disenchantment?
Well, I know you slightly disagree with me on this, but I think that we will look back in not so long time after the inevitable Conservative disaster that's coming down the road and realise that the ousting of Boris Johnson was a historic mistake as far as the Conservative Party was concerned. Yes, they were slightly behind in the polls, so 5 points behind in the polls, but he was the only person who could connect with the new voting base. He was the only one with the charisma to take them forward. And yes, they may well have lost, but they certainly, we're looking at that infamous Canada result proportions if things really go wrong.
Well, Canada, of course, for those that don't know, 30 years ago, Canada, with the first past-the-post electoral system, actually saw the governing Conservative Party reduced to 2 seats.
2 seats.
Memory serves me correctly, to be replaced by, oddly, a party called Reform. Difficult to see a change that seismic going on.
Well, you say that. I mean, but if support for Reform continues to grow, I'm not just saying this because I'm on your show, but if you come back and the Conservatives fail to move the dial in any respect on policies and things, they're going to try and tuck a few tax cuts, but will it be enough? Then, you can see their vote dropping to the high teens, Reform's going to the mid to late teens as well, and that's enough to squeeze. I mean, I look at the polls, I'm sure Henry does as well. Week in, week out, we can see that, less than half the 2019 Conservative voters would still vote Conservative again, and that, 1 in 20 of those voters who got that record majority are staying at home or supporting Reform.
Yeah. Would it be credible, Henry, would it be credible to have yet another leader? Or is Clark right in saying, he spoke to the BBC today, he said, look, the chap that shouts iceberg is never very popular, but it doesn't mean that it's the wrong thing to do. And I kind of got the logic of what he was saying there. But, I mean, would the public put up with yet another change of Prime Minister? Incidentally, a Prime Minister they haven't actually voted for.
Well, I mean, there would be enormous pressure on that new Prime Minister, whoever they were, to have an early election, which I don't think any Tory MPs want, and I think that's one of the reasons that Sir Simon Clarke is currently in quite a lonely position out in his foxhole. But the problem the Conservatives have is that there's no prince or princess over the water with a plan, with a vision, with a strategy who's waiting to take over, right? So what Sir Simon is proposing is basically to just hit the change button and then see what happens. And that means you have to have a leadership contest with all that... that was brutal for the Conservative Party last time when it was Truss versus Sunak, a hideous process. And at the end of that, you have someone else. You still have a divided party. They still don't have the authority to impose their will on the electorate. And most of the insuperable problems that Britain is facing that have built up over the 14 years, and indeed longer, over the last 14 years are still there, right? You can't fix the housing crisis meaningfully in 6 months?
No, sure.
Right, you can't...
No, sure. I get that, but it's about the outward projection of what you are as a party. I mean, right at the minute, they're a broad church with no religion. That's how I put them. Now, on the 6th of February, Liz Truss is having an event. There'll be other senior Conservative figures there. It's the launch of this new concept of popular conservatism. Is this something that maybe after the election becomes a new way for the party?
Potentially. That's what's really going on, I think, is that after the election there's going to be a huge, huge battle within the Conservative Party to explain the defeat, to explain why after the last 14 years the country hasn't moved in a more conservative direction. You've got the new Conservatives under Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates. You've now got the Popular Conservatives. The One Nation group will have their own answers. And that is going to be absolutely fascinating. But that's for after the election. That's not a discussion about how you somehow win a 5th term in October 2024. I don't think that's doable.
It's just not going to happen.
No.
No, I have to say, you know, when I hear the deputy editor of Conservative Home putting things in terms as bleak as that, it's quite telling, David, isn't it?
I would slightly disagree in the sense I do think there are potential leaders there with alternative views. I mean, you know, Suella Braverman is one of them. And she does have a fairly clear idea of what she would do. The problem is that the vast majority of the parliamentary party, not the membership of the party, parliamentary party, don't like it and won't sort of abide with that sort of view. You know, they don't want to leave the ECHR. They're quite globalist in their viewpoints, you know. And this is and the problem going forward for the Conservative Party is probably the One Nation MPs on the left who have wrecked the last 14 years, the ones who are probably going to survive this disaster and reset
because it's the Red Wallers that'll lose their seats, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the Red Wallers will lose.
It's the Brexiteers that'll lose their seats.
The Red Wallers, for starters. There's an awful lot of others. I think one of the things that's really spooking the Conservatives is also the Blue Wall. You know, all of those historically safe Conservative seats, been Tory for 100 years, now looking vulnerable. Well,
that's interesting, because for the 3rd PMQs in a row, Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, wasn't in the chamber. Do you get the feeling if a stronger Liberal Democrat leader, they'd be in even more trouble?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of seats where Labour simply aren't competitive in the South West and the home counties where the Liberal Democrats have always been, in modern history, the kind of left-wing option.
Somerset, Surrey.
Yeah, and the Lib Dems were looking incredibly strong. They opened their local government campaign in my hometown. They really were parking tanks on Tory lawns. And then all of a sudden, Sir Ed Davey goes into hiding because of the postmasters scandal. I think there'll probably be some Tory MPs in the autumn who, if they hold on by the skin of their teeth, who will have that to thank for it.
Well, but they do have somebody ready to replace him in Daisy Cooper. And I think they could be in serious problems if they do actually make that switch.
Is Davy's position in peril? Is Ed Davy's position in peril?
Yes, I think it is, yes. I think it is.
Well, imminently?
It's difficult to tell with the Lib Dems because they're such a small, tight-knit group, but I think it is. And there's a lot of talk about Daisy Cooper being brought in to replace him now. And, and actually a lot of Conservative MPs in the South are quite worried about that. They'd quite like Ed Davey to stay. So...
Interesting. Gentlemen, thank you. Well, there we are.